reserving the right to object. We should all be very, very clear. The working class of this country today faces more economic desperation than at any time since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And working families need help now. Not next year, but right now. Last night, the House of Representatives, with a two-thirds majority, 275 to 134, two-thirds bipartisan vote, moved to increase the direct payment going to working families from $600 per adult to $2,000 per adult. The House did the right thing. I congratulate them. And now it is time for the Senate to step up to the plate and do what the working families of this country overwhelmingly want us to do. Madam President, as a result of the pandemic, tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs and their incomes. These families in the middle of the winter now face the threat of eviction and the possibility of being thrown out in the streets. Hunger in America is at the highest level that it has been for decades, with moms and dads struggling to feed their kids and working families lining up mile after mile to get emergency food packages. We are even seeing an increase in grocery store shoplifting as desperate Americans try to keep their families from going hungry. All of this taking place in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. Madam President, over the last number of years, as I think everybody in America knows, Congress has provided massive tax breaks for the very wealthiest people in our country, which is one of the reasons why today we have more income and wealth inequality than any time since the 1920s. In fact, in the midst of this pandemic, this terrible pandemic, inequality has grown worse, with many in the billionaire class seeing their wealth increase by hundreds of billions of dollars, while average Americans struggle to put food on the table. Congress has given huge tax breaks to large corporations so that some of the most profitable and largest corporations in America today pay zero in federal income taxes. We have just passed the largest military budget in the history of our country, $740 billion, more than the next 10 nations combined. And by the way, there was almost no debate about the size of that huge budget. Trump's veto dealt with other issues. Meanwhile, over 500,000 Americans are homeless. Half of our working families are struggling to survive paycheck to paycheck. And in the midst of this terrible, unprecedented pandemic, over 90 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured in the midst of a pandemic, and they're not sure whether they can afford to go to a doctor. Madam President, we are coming to the close of one of the most terrible and painful years in American history. That is a tragic fact. Over 330,000 of our people have died from COVID-19, and as we speak, we are seeing record-breaking numbers of new cases and hospitals around the country being overwhelmed with new admissions. During the last year, the education and well-being of tens of millions of our young people, from childcare to graduate school, has been disrupted. And the terrible emotional isolation that this pandemic has caused, where people are unable to spend time with their family or their friends, has resulted in a huge increase in mental illness, drug addiction, and even suicide. Madam President, as I mentioned, the House has done the right thing. By an overwhelming vote, Democrats and Republicans voted to increase that $600 direct payment to $2,000. Recent poll came out. 78% of the American people think that was the right decision. They're hurting. They want help. The leaders of our country, President Trump, President-elect Biden, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, are all in agreement. We have got to raise that direct payment to $2,000. So that is where we are right now in this historic moment. Do we turn our backs on struggling working families, or do we respond to their pain? So, Madam President, would the senator modify his request that immediately following the vote on the veto override, the Senate proceed to the consideration of H.R. 9051, that the bill be considered read a third time and the Senate vote on passage of the bill without intervening action or debate. Further, that if passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection to the request for modification?
Object.
Objection is heard. Is there objection to the original?
I object.
Objection is heard. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Oh, I'm sorry, Frank. Oh, okay.
No, you see?
You're just going to go ahead and get up. Start speaking. Yep.
Madam President?
The senator.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this is our historic moment. We can see the suffering across our country. We can see how desperate people are. We can see how during this holiday season that people are looking at the prospects, in the words of Tony Fauci, where the worst may be ahead of us for these families. The worst may yet to have been actually inflicted upon families in our country, and yet the Republicans are refusing to allow for a vote on giving each individual $2,000 in order to make it through the rest of this pandemic. And Senator Sanders today speaks for the millions of Americans who are suffering through a devastating health crisis, an unemployment crisis, an eviction crisis, a hunger crisis, and a crisis of faith. Faith that their leaders in this country will stand up and provide for Americans in their hour of need. Meanwhile, we here in Washington, we must confront a moral crisis. Why can't we keep working families from starving even as we stand ready to approve a massive defense bill? That's why I'm here with my colleague, Bernie Sanders, to call for a simple vote to provide $2,000 in direct cash payments to Americans across our country. It's this simple. Just like they did in the House of Representatives, the Senate should have a vote, up or down, yes or no, on providing these increased cash payments to desperate Americans. We can get this done quickly and before the holiday if Leader McConnell will simply agree to do it. They already had this vote in the House. 46 Republicans voted for it. Give the Republicans in the Senate the same opportunity to vote. We already know that many of them have already said they will vote for the $2,000 if they get a chance to vote. It's this simple. We can do this because a simple vote will just say that you want to provide a grand total of $2,000 to Americans who need it to pay the rent, to keep the electricity on, to buy diapers, to pay for life-saving medication, just to survive this devastating pandemic. 44 House Republicans voted for the $2,000 checks. I believe that Republicans in this chamber will do so as well. And President Trump has already made it very clear he will sign that bill. So we can see where the opposition is. It's the leadership of the Republicans in the United States Senate. People across our country are falling ill and falling behind on their bills. And for the families of the hundreds of thousands who have died in the coronavirus, medical and funeral expenses are compounding their grief. They need money in their pockets. In Massachusetts, this past Sunday, we hit 100 deaths in a single day, the highest death toll our state has seen in a 24-hour period since the very beginning of this pandemic. In the week before Christmas, 21,000 new people in our state applied for unemployment benefits, just as Donald Trump let these protections lapse before millions of Americans were losing their benefits, and that is a tragedy. A $2,000 check is the most direct and effective mechanism for delivering economic relief right now to those barely holding on throughout this crisis, particularly low-income Americans, immigrant communities, our gig, our service workers, our essential workers. They need help. They have been helping our families. We need to help their families. And right now, these checks would help 158 million people across our country pay for housing, put food on the table, make sure that grandma and grandpa have their diabetes or heart medication. That's why Senator Sanders, Senator Kamala Harris, and I introduced legislation to provide every person in our country, regardless of immigration status, with $2,000 monthly recurring payments to help weather this storm. We knew then, 7 months ago, that a single $1,200 relief check was not going to be enough to help families get by. And the $600 payment in the latest coronavirus package is crumbs to working people who have faced economic hardship through no fault of their own. It won't even cover a month of rent, let alone heating bills, food bills, Wi-Fi bills for students learning from home, and all the other expenses which are piling up for these families. Now, some of my Republican colleagues have said that providing $2,000 would be too expensive. Well, here are some other costs they seem to have forgotten. If our proposal to increase stimulus checks to $2,000 is signed, the overall cost of the stimulus bill would go from $900 billion to $1.36 trillion. Yes, that is $464 billion increase over what we were currently projecting for this bill. But it is only a fraction of the $740 billion defense bill that this chamber stands ready to approve again this week. My Republican colleagues, and I hate to say this, but my Republican colleagues seem more interested in funding defense than in funding the defenseless. And that's what this debate is all about. What do we do to help these defenseless families? In this moment of national crisis, we are able to afford spending $750 billion on a bloated defense budget, spending that is supposed to protect our country, yet did nothing to inoculate against the most profound public health emergency in a century. But we can't give hungry and suffering Americans $2,000. That is a moral failure for our country. Give Americans this money. Most of my colleagues support this defense budget. They got to vote on it a few weeks ago, and I know they stand ready to override President Trump's racist, belligerent veto. We're here today asking the same thing for $2,000 payments, a simple up or down vote. Let's bring the House bill up for a vote. Leader Schumer is committed to bringing it forward. We can get this done before the holiday. We can do this for Americans before the year is out. We must remember that what makes America the envy of the world is not simply the strength of our defense and military, but the strength of our people. People like Ahmed Jaya, a parent of 3, who was laid off from his job as a doorman at the Omni Parker House in Boston this past March. Ahmed receives $400 a week in unemployment benefits, but it is not enough to cover the bills that keep rolling in as he now faces expiring health coverage as well. Or people like Tanya DeStefano from Spencer, Massachusetts, who gave birth to a beautiful baby boy on Halloween and returned from the hospital to find an eviction notice taped to the front of her door. These are the stories that should be driving our fights. These are the people who need relief now. And these checks will go right back into our economy because people will spend this money. They need it for the necessities which are confronting their families right now. Last week, Donald Trump used these people as political pawns. He stalled signing the coronavirus relief package, claiming that he wants to give $2,000 checks to every American. By delaying, President Trump may have stiffed unemployed Americans out of $300 this week in unemployment benefits, benefits that they will not get back. So let's now hold Donald Trump to his word. Let's bring this to a vote. And let's pass $2,000 relief checks for every person in our country and put that bill on Donald Trump's desk. This pandemic has laid bare the tragedy of 2 Americas, one in which billionaires grew their wealth by $931 billion over the course of this pandemic, an America where the rich continue to get richer, and the other America that has seen unprecedented economic uncertainty, Great Depression-level unemployment rates, and devastating losses, where Black and Latinx workers suffer disproportionately higher rates of unemployment, and their families suffer higher rates of coronavirus infection and death, where workers get laid off while CEOs get raises and companies engage in stock buyback plans, where residents get evicted or their electricity shut off, but major corporations barely pay taxes. For those workers and families and struggling households in America, for the vast majority of America, $2,000 is a lifeline. And it is time for Leader McConnell to bring this legislation to the floor for a vote. The American people have a right to know where every member of the Senate stands on this issue. They now know where President Trump says he stands. They now know where every member of the United States House of Representatives stands. And the American people have a right to know, in this desperate time that we are living through, who was on their side to give their families the help which they needed. Senator Sanders is right. We should have a vote. It should be yes or no. And we should do this before the end of this year. Madam President, I yield back the balance of my time.